My name is Claire. I am 33 years old and a senior forensic auditor. Trapped in a suffocating elevator for 8 hours, the man I swore to spend my life with made a choice. With rescue finally in sight and the cables groaning above us, my husband hauled his young mistress to safety. I was 7 months pregnant with his child bleeding on the floor, and he left me behind in the dark. But when he finally returned to the lobby, with news cameras flashing, screaming to play the worried husband, his colleague handed him a single envelope that destroyed his entire world. If you have ever been abandoned by the person you trusted most, in the exact moment you face death, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit that like and subscribe button, because what I did to him after I survived will leave you absolutely speechless. My life before that terrifying day looked like a modern American success story. I was married to David, a 35-year-old tech visionary, and the chief executive officer of a highly anticipated software startup based in Seattle. We lived in a stunning modern home overlooking the Puget Sound, and from the outside, we were the ultimate power couple. David was brilliant, charismatic, and endlessly ambitious. His company was just weeks away from a massive initial public offering, poised to hit the stock market and turn him into a billionaire overnight. He walked around the city like he already owned it, wearing custom-tailored suits and giving interviews to financial magazines about his self-made empire. What the journalists did not know, and what David himself did not even realize, was that his empire was built on a secret. 3 years ago, his startup had been bleeding capital and teetering on the edge of total bankruptcy. He was desperate, facing the collapse of his dreams. During that critical time, a silent angel investor stepped in with a $15 million injection, saving the company from ruin and securing a massive block of hidden equity. David boasted to his friends about his incredible pitching skills that landed the anonymous whale investor. He never suspected that the whale was actually his quiet, analytical wife. Through a blind trust managed by a corporate law firm, I was the one who funded his success. My career as a forensic auditor meant I knew exactly how to structure the investment to remain completely untraceable. I wanted to support my husband without bruising his fragile ego, believing that a rising tide would lift both our ships. I truly thought we were building a secure future for our family, especially since I was currently carrying our first child. The reality of our marriage, however, had grown increasingly cold as the IPO date approached. David was perpetually absent, claiming that the demands of taking a company public required all his time and energy. When he was home, he was glued to his phone, texting constantly. He claimed it was just crisis management with his public relations team. His newly hired public relations manager was Savannah, a 26-year-old woman with an aggressive ambition that matched his own. She was always perfectly styled, always at his side during press events, and always casting thinly veiled glances of superiority in my direction whenever I attended company functions. I dismissed my unease as pregnancy hormones and stress, choosing to trust the man I loved. That blind trust led me straight into the darkest day of my life. It was a typical rainy Tuesday morning in Seattle when I decided to visit the company headquarters. I needed David to sign some routine tax documents regarding our personal assets. I navigated the bustling glass and steel lobby of the skyscraper, my hand resting protectively over my 7-month baby bump. The receptionist greeted me warmly and waved me through the security gates. I took the express elevator up to the executive floors, entirely unaware that the grand illusion of my life was about to shatter completely. I found David near the executive suite, standing uncomfortably close to Savannah. When they noticed me, they sprang apart with an awkward suddenness that made my stomach churn. Savannah quickly smoothed her skirt and offered me a saccharine smile, asking how the baby was doing, in a tone that felt entirely hollow. David seemed irritated by my unexpected arrival, glancing at his expensive watch and complaining that he had a crucial board meeting on the 42nd floor in exactly 5 minutes. He snatched the tax documents from my hand, barely looking at them, before signing his name and shoving them back. He turned on his heel and marched toward the elevators, expecting me to simply leave. But the documents required a second signature from his financial officer, so I followed him into the elevator bank. Savannah trailed right behind him, carrying a stack of press releases. Two young interns carrying coffee trays scrambled into the elevator car, just as the heavy metal doors began to slide shut. The six of us stood in the polished steel cabin as it ascended smoothly. The digital display blinked rapidly, marking our progress up the skyscraper. We passed the 20th floor, then the 30th. The atmosphere inside the car was thick with unspoken tension. I stood near the back watching the reflection of David and Savannah in the mirrored doors. They were making subtle eye contact, communicating silently in a way that made my chest tighten with a sudden, horrible realization. We reached the 40th floor. Then a horrific snapping sound echoed through the shaft. It sounded like a massive steel whip cracking against the walls. The elevator car jerked violently, throwing us all off balance. The digital display flickered and died. Suddenly, the floor dropped out from under us. We were in freefall. The sickening sensation of weightlessness took over as the car plummeted down the dark shaft. The interns screamed. The plunge felt like an eternity, a terrifying free fall down the hollow skyscraper. Air rushed past the cabin with a deafening roar. We dropped 5 solid stories before the emergency braking system engaged. The steel calipers clamped onto the guide rails with a violent crunch that threw everyone to the floor. Sparks showered down the glass walls and then absolute blackness. The power failed instantly. The ventilation system died, leaving a heavy silence broken only by the sobbing interns. I hit the floor hard, my shoulder absorbing the impact to protect my stomach. Agonizing pain flared across my lower abdomen. I curled into a fetal position, gasping for air, as severe Braxton Hicks contractions seized my body. The air inside the small metal box grew hot and stale. Warm dampness spread across my thighs. I was bleeding. Panic seized my throat. I desperately needed my husband, David. I reached out in the pitch blackness, sweeping my hand across the cold floor, whispering his name. I needed him to hold my hand and make the terror go away. I dragged myself forward, my fingers brushing against the edge of a wool suit jacket. I exhaled a shaky breath of relief, reaching up to grab his sleeve. At that exact second, a faint, sickly green emergency LED light flickered to life in the ceiling panel. The dim glow illuminated the nightmare unfolding right beside me. David was not looking for me. He was not calling my name. He was huddled in the corner, his arms wrapped fiercely around Savannah. He was shielding her body with his own, stroking her hair. He pulled her face close and whispered, "I have got you. You are safe." He kissed her forehead, completely absorbed in her well-being. I lay there on the filthy metal floor, clutching my pregnant belly, bleeding, while the man I married comforted his mistress. He did not even cast a glance in my direction. The physical pain of my contractions was eclipsed by a profound betrayal. I watched the man I loved, the man whose company I secretly saved, prioritize another woman, while our unborn child and I suffered in the dark. The two interns huddled on the opposite side, oblivious to the twisted tragedy playing out in the emergency lighting. I pulled my hand back from his jacket, biting my lip until I tasted blood to keep from screaming. I forced myself to breathe through the contractions, realizing in that suffocating metal box that I was entirely alone. 8 excruciating hours dragged by. Every minute felt like grinding glass. The temperature inside the elevator car skyrocketed, turning the small space into an oven. Condensation gathered on the steel walls. My body ached with every breath, the contractions coming in unpredictable waves. I managed to drag myself to the far wall, tearing a piece of my blouse to press against my bleeding legs. Across the cabin, David and Savannah remained intertwined. They whispered to each other, a sickening murmur of shared reassurances that completely excluded me. When David finally noticed me slumped against the wall, he offered nothing but a hollow, detached glance before pulling Savannah closer. He did not ask if I was hurt. He did not ask about the baby. The man I thought I knew simply ceased to exist, replaced by a stranger who viewed me as nothing more than collateral damage. Then the smell of burning rubber and melting plastic began to seep through the floorboards. An electrical fire had sparked somewhere down the shaft, and thick, acrid smoke began billowing up into our trapped cabin. The interns started coughing violently, banging on the doors, screaming for help. The air grew visibly gray, burning our eyes and searing our lungs. I covered my face with my jacket, struggling to draw in oxygen for my baby. Just as the smoke threatened to choke the life out of us, a loud metallic banging echoed from above. Heavy boots thudded against the roof of the car. Sparks flew as a rescue team used a power saw to cut through the reinforced ceiling hatch. The metal groaned and peeled back, revealing the beam of a heavy-duty flashlight and the soot-stained face of a firefighter. The relief was overwhelming. Fresh air poured in through the jagged opening. The firefighter yelled down to us, his voice cutting through the panic. "The main cable is fracturing. We have to move right now, but we can only hoist one person at a time. Women and the pregnant lady come up first." I pushed myself up my legs, trembling unsteadily under my weight, reaching my hand toward the light. But before I could even take a single step forward, David lunged. He violently shoved me backward. His heavy shoulder slammed directly into my chest, sending me crashing hard against the steel wall. I collapsed to the floor, gasping in shock and pain. David grabbed Savannah by her waist and practically threw her upward toward the open hatch. "Take Savannah first," he screamed at the rescuers, his voice cracking with feigned panic. "She has severe asthma. She cannot breathe." It was a complete calculated lie. Savannah did not have asthma. The firefighters, blinded by the thick smoke and operating on split-second emergency protocols, grabbed her outstretched arms and hauled her up to safety. The elevator gave a terrifying metallic lurch as the main cable snapped another steel strand. David did not wait for the rescuers to lower the harness again. Acting on pure primal selfishness, he leaped up, grabbing the edges of the cut hatch. I reached out, crying for him to help me. In his frantic scramble to save his own life, his heavy leather shoe lashed out, kicking me squarely in the shoulder. He hauled his upper body through the opening, looking down at me, bleeding in the smoke. "I will make them come back for you," he yelled. The hatch slammed shut, leaving me completely behind. The echo of the metal hatch slamming shut vibrated through the floorboards. I lay completely still in the suffocating darkness, surrounded by the acrid stench of burning wires and the terrified sobs of the two interns left behind with me. The heat was unbearable, pressing against my skin like a physical weight. My lungs burned with every shallow breath. I coughed, tasting soot. For the first few minutes, the shock of David's heavy boot connecting with my shoulder blinded me to everything else. The man I secretly elevated, the man carrying my child, had kicked me back into a burning cage to save his mistress. Tears streamed down my face, mixing with sweat, but they did not last long. Lying on that cold floor, clutching my stomach to protect the only life that mattered now, something inside me fundamentally shifted. The desperate weeping wife died right there in the smoke. In her place, a profound stillness took over. My sorrow calcified into cold, hardened rage. I am a senior forensic auditor. My entire career is built on dismantling complex frauds, tracing hidden liabilities, and executing ruthless calculations. David thought he left behind a dependent, weak wife who would quietly perish and solve all his messy problems. He had no idea he just forged his own destruction. I stopped crying. I regulated my breathing, taking short sips of the toxic air. I forced myself to sit up, using the handrail for support, and ordered the panicked interns to stay low where the air was marginally clearer. We were not going to die in this shaft. Above us, the sound of the main elevator cable tearing echoed down the shaft. Steel threads snapped with the crack of a whip. The metal box groaned. The interns screamed, clinging to each other in the dark. I pressed my back against the wall, calculating the seconds we had left. Just as the cabin lurched downward, a tremendous crash exploded from the side doors. Sparks flew into the cabin as a rotary saw sliced through the heavy steel doors. A secondary emergency crew had forcefully breached the outer doors and pried open the elevator car from the side. Thick smoke billowed out into the hallway as flashlights pierced the gloom. Strong hands reached into the cabin, grabbing the interns first and hauling them to safety. A firefighter grabbed my arms, his grip bruising but secure. I pushed off the floor with everything I had left, throwing myself through the narrow gap. The second my boots hit the solid concrete floor of the hallway, a deafening snap reverberated through the building. The main cable completely failed. The elevator car plummeted into the abyss, crashing into the sub-basement 40 floors below with a boom that shook the dust from the ceiling tiles. I lay on the concrete, coughing violently, staring into the empty shaft where I was supposed to be entombed. Emergency medical technicians swarmed the hallway, shouting orders and unrolling oxygen masks. One knelt beside me, flashing a light in my eyes and trying to strap a cervical collar around my neck. He shouted that I needed to be transported to the nearest trauma center immediately for fetal monitoring. I pushed his hands away, refusing the mask. I was not going to be strapped to a gurney and wheeled out through the main lobby like a helpless victim for David to find and exploit for his public relations narrative. I needed control and absolute secrecy. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out my phone. The screen was cracked, but it functioned perfectly. I bypassed the medics and dialed my brother Ryan. Ryan was a former military intelligence officer who had spent multiple tours extracting targets from hostile environments. Now he ran an elite private physical extraction firm. He answered on the first ring. I did not waste time with tears or explanations. I gave him my exact coordinates, told him I was bleeding, and issued a single unbreakable command. I told him to bypass the city emergency protocols and get me out of the building without anyone knowing. Ryan asked no questions. His voice shifted into a tactical calm, instructing me to reach the adjacent rooftop helipad in 5 minutes. I forced myself onto my feet, ignoring the frantic protests of the paramedics. The adrenaline coursing through my veins masked the sharp pain radiating across my abdomen and my bruised shoulder. I bypassed the chaotic evacuation routes and utilized a restricted executive access corridor that I knew intimately from my forensic audits of the building's infrastructure. I navigated the glass sky bridge connecting the startup headquarters to the neighboring high-rise, moving like a ghost through the smoke-filled halls. By the time I forced open the heavy fire doors to the adjacent rooftop, the deafening roar of rotor blades was already cutting through the fierce storm clouds. A sleek, unmarked private medical helicopter hovered low, its landing skids touching down precisely on the painted circle. 2 medics in tactical gear leaped out before the chopper even fully settled. They secured me to a mobile stretcher with efficient precision, shielding my pregnant body from the biting wind and rain. As they loaded me into the aircraft, I looked down at the chaotic scene unfolding on the busy streets far below. Dozens of fire trucks, city ambulances, and police cruisers bathed the wet pavement in flashing lights. News vans were already swarming the perimeter, setting up broadcast cameras. Somewhere down there, David was preparing to give the performance of his life, playing the tech executive, waiting for news of his beloved wife. He thought he had complete control of the narrative. He thought he had successfully buried his biggest secret in the rubble. As the helicopter banked sharply and accelerated into the gray sky, I watched his building shrink into a meaningless speck. I disappeared from the scene entirely, leaving absolutely no trace behind for him to find anywhere. He had left me alone in the dark to die, but he was the one who was truly blind. Down on the ground floor, the main lobby of the corporate headquarters had been transformed into a staging area for first responders and local news crews. The massive glass doors were propped wide open, allowing the freezing rain and the deafening wail of sirens to fill the cavernous space. Flashing red and blue lights painted the marble walls, creating a chaotic strobe effect over the panicked employees and emergency personnel. Right in the center of this media circus stood David. He had intentionally smeared a thick streak of dark soot across his forehead and torn the collar of his expensive custom shirt to complete the look of a desperate, heroic survivor. Savannah sat on the bumper of an ambulance just a few yards away, draped in a shiny silver thermal blanket. She was clutching a plastic oxygen mask to her face, forcing out loud theatrical coughs to sell the illusion of her severe asthma attack. They had rehearsed this exact narrative during their descent. David was currently surrounded by 3 different camera crews playing the role of the distraught husband to absolute perfection. He ran his trembling hands through his perfectly styled hair and looked directly into the lens of a local news camera. His voice shook with manufactured grief as he spoke to the reporter. He claimed that the smoke was too thick, that he had fought tooth and nail to hold on to his pregnant wife, but the rescue workers had forcefully dragged him up through the hatch against his will. He painted a masterful picture of a man utterly broken by circumstances beyond his control. He wiped a dry eye and pleaded with the firefighters to let him go back inside the burning shaft. It was a flawless award-winning performance designed to secure public sympathy right before his company launched its massive public offering. As David continued his tragic monologue, his eyes scanned the chaotic lobby. He spotted Mitchell, his chief financial officer, standing near the police barricades. Mitchell had always been a quiet, intensely sharp man. He had worked with me for years before I secretly maneuvered him into the chief financial position at David's company. David knew none of this. To David, Mitchell was just another loyal subordinate, a bean counter who existed solely to balance the books and sign off on executive expenses. Seeing an opportunity to escalate his public performance, David broke away from the reporters and stormed across the wet marble floor. The camera crews eagerly trailed right behind him, their heavy spotlights illuminating his path. David approached Mitchell with wide, frantic eyes. He grabbed the lapels of Mitchell's pristine trench coat, shaking the older man violently. He projected his voice so the microphones hovering just a few feet away would capture every single syllable of his anguish. "Where is my wife?" David screamed, his face contorted in an exaggerated mask of terror. "Have they pulled her out of the wreckage? Where is Claire? You have to tell me what is happening." Mitchell did not react to the physical assault. He simply stood there rigid and perfectly composed, his eyes locking onto David with a look of absolute unfiltered disgust. Slowly, deliberately, Mitchell reached up and peeled David's trembling hands off his coat. He brushed his shoulders off, as if David had just transferred a foul disease onto him. The reporters leaned in closer, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. The heavy silence between the 2 men cut right through the noise of the bustling lobby. Mitchell reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope. He held it out, pressing it firmly against David's chest. "She left on a private medevac 20 minutes ago," Mitchell said, his voice carrying a cold, metallic authority that completely lacked any sympathy. "And she asked me to give you this, your divorce papers, and a Securities and Exchange Commission subpoena for financial fraud. You are finished, David." The words dropped like anvils onto the marble floor. The reporters shoved their microphones closer, shouting over each other to demand an explanation. David froze, his jaw going entirely slack. The color completely drained from his face, leaving his artificial soot smears looking ridiculous against his sudden, ghostly pallor. He stared down at the heavy manila envelope in his hands, his fingers trembling for real this time. He tore open the top flap and pulled out the crisp, legally binding documents. The divorce papers were thick, detailing immediate separation protocols. But it was the second document that made his knees buckle. The heavy stock paper bore the undeniable, intimidating seal of the federal government. It was an official subpoena from the Securities and Exchange Commission demanding all personal and corporate financial records, citing credible evidence of massive investor fraud. David could barely process the words printed on the page. His mind short-circuited, spinning in a vortex of sudden paranoia and sheer terror. He looked back up at Mitchell, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. How David choked out, dropping the papers back into the envelope. How did she get a private medevac? How did she get a federal subpoena in the middle of the night? Who gave her this? Mitchell offered a slow, predatory smile that sent a shiver down David's spine. You really have no idea who you married, do you? Mitchell adjusted his briefcase and stepped backward seamlessly, blending into the crowd of police officers and emergency workers. Have a good evening, Mr. Chief Executive. David was left completely paralyzed under the glaring lights of the television cameras. His carefully constructed public relations narrative had just been annihilated on live television. The journalists surrounding him stopped asking about the elevator crash and immediately started shouting questions about federal investigations and financial crimes. David looked wildly at the cameras, then down at the federal subpoena in his shaking hands. The brutal reality of the situation crashed down on him with absolutely crushing and devastating weight. Miles away from the flashing cameras and the crumbling facade of David's public image, I sat in the absolute silence of a high-security VIP medical suite. The sterile white walls offered a sharp contrast to the soot-stained nightmare I had barely escaped. My medical team had just finished a comprehensive ultrasound. Hearing the steady thrumming of my baby's heartbeat was the only emotional release I allowed myself. I closed my eyes and placed my hand over my stomach, breathing a silent promise that I would never let anyone jeopardize our safety again. A nurse adjusted my intravenous line, gave me a reassuring nod, and quietly exited. I was battered, my shoulder throbbed with a dark purple bruise from David's heavy boot, but my mind had never been sharper. The heavy oak door of my suite swung open with a purposeful force. Naomi stepped into the room, bringing an atmosphere of absolute authority. My sister-in-law was a formidable African-American corporate attorney, a senior partner at one of the most ruthless litigation firms on the West Coast. She wore a perfectly tailored emerald green suit and stilettos that clicked sharply against the linoleum floor. Naomi did not just practice corporate law, she weaponized it. She took one look at my pale face, her sharp eyes zeroing in on the nasty bruise peeking out from beneath my hospital gown. She did not rush over with tearful hugs. She walked straight to the foot of my bed, placed her leather briefcase on the mattress, and looked me dead in the eye. We do not cry over dead weight, she said, her voice dropping into a register of pure ice. We liquidate it. Right behind her walked my brother Ryan. While Naomi was the legal architect, Ryan was the digital executioner. He carried 2 heavy protective cases and wasted no time exchanging pleasantries. He began unpacking his equipment, transforming my quiet recovery suite into a classified war room. Within 10 minutes, he had set up a localized Faraday cage to block any unauthorized cellular tracking, established an encrypted routing network, and mounted 3 portable monitors on the hospital tray table. Ryan worked with the lethal efficiency of a man who had spent years hunting cyber terrorists. I want complete digital darkness, Ryan announced, his fingers flying across his keyboard as cascading lines of code flooded the monitor. I am scrubbing your medical admission records from the Central Hospital database. I am blacklisting David's phone number, his corporate accounts, and his public relations team. You do not exist on the grid right now. I adjusted my hospital bed, sitting up straight despite the sharp pain through my ribs. The strategy was clear. We were not going to engage in a messy, emotional domestic dispute. There would be no tearful phone calls demanding to know why he abandoned me in the elevator. There would be no furious text messages cursing Savannah's name. Giving David an emotional reaction would only feed his massive ego and give him a target to manipulate. He thrived on chaos and emotional control, using them to gaslight anyone who challenged him. We were going to starve him of the very oxygen he needed to survive. Total absolute radio silence. By denying him any access to my emotional state, we would force him into severe paranoia. Naomi opened her briefcase and laid out a stack of corporate filings across my bed. Our objective is surgical dismantling, she explained, tapping a manicured finger against David's pre-initial public offering prospectus. David thinks his biggest problem right now is a damaged public image and a missing wife. He has no idea that the foundation of his entire company is built on a fault line you control. He is 2 weeks away from ringing the bell on the NASDAQ. He needs everything to look financially pristine to his institutional investors. We are going to let him believe he can salvage this. We are going to let him scramble, let him spin his lies and climb to the top of the ladder. And then I added my voice devoid of any warmth. We burn the ladder to the ground. Exactly. Naomi smiled coldly. The Securities and Exchange Commission subpoena Mitchell handed him was merely the warning shot. It will freeze his preliminary asset transfers and force him to rely on internal cash reserves. If we want to trigger the total financial clawback clause embedded in your original angel investment contract, we need undeniable proof of criminal financial negligence. We need to prove he has been actively defrauding the company. Ryan cracked his knuckles, a grim look settling over his face. That is where I come in, he said. Claire, you left a dormant backdoor protocol in their accounting software when you first audited their books 3 years ago. I am going to wake it up. I am going to bypass their two-factor authentication mirror, their executive servers, and pull every single deleted email, encrypted message, and offshore wire transfer David thought he had permanently erased. We are going to see exactly what he and Savannah have been doing with the investors' capital. I looked at the glowing monitors, watching the data streams flow into our secure network. The trauma of the elevator, the terror of the smoke, the agonizing heartbreak of watching my husband choose his mistress over our unborn child fueled my focus. David believed he had successfully discarded me to pave the way for his glorious billionaire future. He thought I was just a naive auditor who would quietly disappear. He fundamentally misunderstood the woman he married. I was not going to fight him for his love or his attention. I was going to take his company, strip his assets, and hand him directly to the federal authorities. The war had officially begun. This was no longer a marriage. It was a hostile takeover, and I was holding all the keys to the kingdom he so desperately wanted to rule. Ryan initiated the infiltration sequence without another word. The heavy silence in the hospital room was broken only by the rapid, rhythmic clacking of his keyboard. I leaned forward against my pillows, ignoring the sharp pull of my bruised ribs, my eyes locked on the center monitor. 3 years ago, when I quietly saved David's company from total ruin, I insisted on implementing a proprietary accounting architecture. I told him it was standard practice for institutional investors. What I did not tell him was that the architecture contained a dormant master key. It was a fail-safe, a digital tripwire designed to grant me full administrative access if the company financials ever displayed irregular behavior. Today, that tripwire was activated. Ryan bypassed the corporate firewall in less than 4 minutes. He sliced through the two-factor authentication protocols David had bragged about during technology conferences, rendering the company's elite cybersecurity measures completely useless. The screen flickered, shifting from lines of code to the structured, organized interface of the executive financial servers. We were inside the belly of the beast. My forensic auditor instincts immediately took over. I instructed Ryan to pull up the general ledger, focusing specifically on the discretionary spending accounts allocated to the public relations department. If David and Savannah were hiding something, they would hide it in the noise of marketing campaigns and vendor contracts. Ryan executed the query, filtering thousands of transactions from the past 18 months. At first glance, the records appeared perfectly normal. Savannah had authorized payments to media consultants, event planners, and digital advertisers. But as I scrutinized the vendor identification numbers, a glaring anomaly caught my eye. The billing structures were too perfect. The invoice amounts were consistently rounded to the nearest 10,000, and the payment dates perfectly aligned with the end of each fiscal quarter. Genuine vendors have irregular expenses, variable tax rates, and unpredictable billing cycles. I told Ryan to cross-reference the vendor routing numbers with the global banking registry. The progress bar loaded on the screen, verifying the data against international records. When the results populated, Naomi let out a low whistle. 7 major vendors, accounting for roughly 40% of the public relations budget, did not exist. They were phantom entities, shell companies registered to a single post office box in the Cayman Islands. The magnitude of the fraud began to reveal itself in high definition. This was not a simple case of a cheating husband buying expensive dinners or diamond necklaces for his mistress. This was a highly orchestrated, malicious financial crime. David and Savannah had been systematically siphoning investor capital right under the noses of the board of directors. I had Ryan trace the flow of capital out of the Cayman accounts. He deployed a tracking algorithm, unmasking the offshore transactions layer by layer. The money did not sit idle in the Caribbean. It was funneled back into the United States through a blind corporate trust. Ryan cracked the trust documents, pulling up the final asset ledger. The numbers were absolutely staggering. Exactly $4 million had been embezzled and laundered. The ultimate destination of those stolen funds appeared on the screen: a certified deed of trust for a massive custom-built luxury mansion located in the exclusive mountains of Aspen, Colorado. I stared at the digital copy of the property deed. The primary beneficiary listed on the document was not a corporate entity. It was Savannah. David had literally stolen $4 million from the company I saved, risking his entire initial public offering to buy his 26-year-old mistress a mountain estate. He had bankrolled his illicit romance with the very capital I had injected into his failing dream. The audacity was breathtaking. He had taken the safety net I provided for our future, for our unborn child, and handed it to the woman he chose to save in the elevator. Naomi leaned over the monitor, her sharp eyes scanning the forged signatures on the wire transfers. She pointed out that David had utilized his executive privileges to override the secondary approvals, making him solely liable for the federal crimes. Savannah was listed as the managing director of the shell companies, making her a direct co-conspirator. They had constructed their own legal graveyard. I felt a cold, sharp smile form on my lips. The elevator drop had nearly broken my body, but this discovery just handed me the weapon I needed to completely break their lives. David believed he was a master manipulator, a brilliant chief executive who could discard his pregnant wife and walk away clean. Instead, he had handed me a loaded gun. The financial records were meticulously downloaded onto Ryan's encrypted hard drives, securing the undeniable proof of their federal crimes. We had absolutely everything we needed: the embezzlement, the wire fraud, the money laundering, and the undeniable concrete link connecting David and Savannah to the stolen $4 million. They had left a trail of breadcrumbs that a forensic auditor like me could follow blindfolded. The trap was set perfectly primed for the day he thought he would become a billionaire. We were not just going to ruin his reputation. We were going to obliterate his freedom. I watched the long download finally finish, confirming that every stolen dollar, every fraudulent invoice, and every lie was securely in my possession. David had traded his family for $4 million and a mountain house. Now I was going to ensure that terrible trade cost him every single second of his future. The digital audit was complete, and the undeniable truth was locked away in our war room. We possessed the exact ammunition required to execute a flawless, devastating takedown. I looked at Naomi and Ryan, my true family, and gave them the final signal. David really thought that he had successfully buried his biggest problem in the dark rubble of that elevator shaft, but he had only managed to dig his very own spectacular, deep, inescapable grave. The heavy silence of our war room was suddenly shattered by a commotion outside the oak doors. Ryan had just securely encrypted the downloaded evidence and snapped his protective cases shut when raised voices echoed from the hospital corridor. My security detail was attempting to block someone from entering the VIP wing. I knew exactly who it was. The Securities and Exchange Commission subpoena Mitchell delivered had undoubtedly triggered an automatic review of David's personal accounts. The freeze on his assets sent him into a blind panic. He needed to control the narrative, and he needed to do it immediately. I nodded to Ryan, signaling him to let our visitor inside. The doors burst open. David rushed into the room, his face twisted into a mask of manufactured anguish. He was holding an obscenely large bouquet of white lilies. Trailing closely behind him was a hired public relations photographer, already raising a heavy camera with a blinding flash attachment. David ignored Naomi and Ryan, completely zeroing in on my hospital bed. He dropped to his knees beside my mattress, grabbing my hand with forceful theatrical desperation. The camera shutter clicked rapidly, capturing the perfect image of the devoted, heartbroken tech executive rushing to his injured wife's side. "Claire, thank God you are safe," David cried out, his voice thick with fake emotion. He buried his face in the hospital blankets near my waist. The performance was nauseating. He looked up, making sure his best angle was presented to the hired photographer. I have been out of my mind with worry. I thought I lost you in that shaft. I did not pull my hand away. I did not scream. I simply stared down at him with eyes as cold and hard as obsidian. My lack of reaction seemed to throw him off balance. He gripped my fingers tighter, leaning in close to deliver the lie he had undoubtedly rehearsed in the mirror all morning. You have to understand why I did what I did, David whispered, projecting his voice just enough for the camera to catch the sorrowful tone. Savannah was hyperventilating. She was having a massive panic attack in the smoke. Her airways were closing. If I had not pushed her up toward the rescue team right that second, she would have suffocated. I had to make an impossible choice. He reached up, trying to brush a stray lock of hair from my forehead, but I slowly turned my face away. I knew you were strong enough to wait, Claire. You are the strongest woman I know. I knew you could hold on for a few more minutes until the firefighters lowered the harness again. I did it because I believed in your strength. The gaslighting was masterful. He was actively trying to reframe his cowardice and betrayal as an act of profound faith in my resilience. He wanted to twist my survival into a compliment, burying his murderous selfishness under a thick layer of romanticized garbage. I remained absolutely stone-faced. I did not blink. I did not speak a single word. My silence stretched out heavy and suffocating, filling the hospital room until the hired photographer shifted uncomfortably on his feet. Sensing that his heartwarming reconciliation photo opportunity was failing miserably, David abruptly dropped the grieving husband act. He stood up, his jaw tightening as he turned to the photographer. "Get out," David ordered sharply. "Wait in the hall. Do not let anyone else inside." The photographer quickly backed out of the room, pulling the heavy door shut behind him. The instant the door clicked into place, the manufactured sorrow completely vanished from David's face. The charming tech visionary was instantly replaced by a ruthless, cornered animal. He tossed the bouquet of lilies carelessly onto the floor. He paced to the end of my bed, glaring at Naomi and Ryan, before turning his furious gaze back to me. "You think you are so clever sending Mitchell down to the lobby with divorce papers and a federal subpoena?" David snarled, his voice dropping into a vicious, menacing register. "You think you can rattle me right before the most important week of my life? My personal banking accounts were flagged for review this morning. I do not know what kind of stunt your lawyers pulled, but it ends right now." He reached into his tailored jacket, pulling out a manila folder and throwing it onto my tray table. The document inside was a marital voting proxy. David needed my signature to consolidate his control over our shared assets and secure absolute voting authority ahead of the initial public offering. He needed to prove to his institutional investors that his impending divorce would not fracture the company's leadership or threaten the stock valuation. "Sign the proxy, Claire," David demanded. "You are going to transfer all your marital voting shares to me. You are going to sign a non-disclosure agreement regarding the elevator incident, and you are going to publicly state that our separation is entirely amicable." I looked down at the documents, then back up at him, maintaining my absolute silence. My refusal to engage enraged him further. He leaned over the bed, bracing his hands on the mattress, bringing his face dangerously close to mine. "You really do not understand the position you are in," David whispered, his tone dripping with malice. He glanced down at my pregnant stomach. "You are carrying a high-risk pregnancy. You are lying in an elite medical suite that costs thousands of dollars a day. Your entire healthcare plan, the premium corporate insurance that covers all your specialized maternal care, and this fancy hospital room is tied directly to my company. You are an independent contractor. You have nothing without my corporate umbrella." He tapped a finger hard against the proxy document. "If you do not sign this transfer right now, I will terminate your health coverage by noon today. I will cut off your insurance, and you can figure out how to pay for your elite doctors and your hospital bills out of pocket. You are an unemployed auditor going through a divorce. You have absolutely no leverage. Sign the paper, Claire, or I promise you and that baby will be thrown out onto the street before the day is over." The threat was vile, a calculated strike at the most vulnerable aspect of my life. He was willing to jeopardize his own unborn child's health just to secure his corporate power. David smiled down at me, utterly convinced that he had cornered a helpless victim. He believed his ultimatum had left me with absolutely no avenue for escape. He was entirely unaware that he had just handed my legal team the exact piece of leverage we needed to destroy him. I looked down at the thick stack of papers resting on my hospital tray. The stark pages represented everything David cared about: control, power, public perception. He stood over me, intoxicated by his perceived dominance. Dealing with a malignant narcissist required feeding his ego until he choked on it. If I fought back now, his paranoia would alert him to the trap. I needed him to believe he had won. I needed him to walk out feeling like an untouchable god. I let my shoulders slump forward, forcing the tension out of my spine to create the perfect picture of a defeated, broken wife. I lowered my gaze, allowing a single, calibrated tear to track down my cheek. I wrapped my arms protectively around my pregnant stomach and let my lower lip tremble. The physical pain from my bruised ribs helped sell the performance. I took a shaky, ragged breath that echoed loudly in the quiet room. "Please do not cancel the insurance, David," I whispered with a pathetic, desperate tremor. My hands shook visibly as I reached out toward the tray table. "The baby needs these specialists. The smoke inhalation requires constant monitoring. Please, I will give you whatever you want. Just do not take away our medical coverage." David smiled. It was not a smile of relief, but a chilling, predatory stretching of his lips. The sight of my supposed surrender filled him with absolute elation. He had successfully weaponized his unborn child's health care to secure corporate voting rights. He reached into his bespoke suit, withdrew a gold fountain pen, and threw it onto the tray table. "I told you it did not have to be difficult, Claire," he said with dripping condescension. "Just sign on the dotted lines and play the role of the supportive estranged wife. Do this properly, and you get to keep your fancy doctors and your comfortable little life." I picked up the heavy gold pen, making sure my fingers quivered wildly over the signature block. I let out another soft, defeated sob. Ryan stood silently in the corner, playing the part of the helpless, angry brother perfectly. Naomi watched from the foot of the bed, her face an unreadable mask of corporate stoicism. I pressed the nib to the paper. I signed my name on the first page, then the second, then the third. The scratch of ink on the heavy paper sounded exceptionally loud. Each signature was a deliberate, calculated strike. With the final page signed, I pushed the folder back across the tray table. David snatched the documents, immediately clutching them to his chest. His greedy eyes scanned the signature blocks to ensure I had not missed a single one. Satisfied that he possessed full proxy control over all marital voting shares, he tucked the folder safely back into his jacket. He adjusted his cuffs, transforming back into the arrogant chief executive. "Smart girl," David remarked, turning toward the heavy oak door. He offered no goodbye or asked how the baby was doing. He simply pulled the door open, eager to get back to his waiting public relations photographer. "Just remember the script, Claire. Amicable separation. Stay off the radar until the initial public offering is completely finalized." The heavy door clicked shut behind him, plunging the room back into secure isolation. For 10 seconds, nobody moved. We listened to the sharp click of David's leather shoes fading down the hospital corridor. When the footsteps completely disappeared, the entire atmosphere inside the VIP suite instantly shifted. The trembling, defeated wife vanished into thin air. I wiped the single fake tear from my cheek, my posture snapping back to perfect, rigid attention. I looked at the foot of my bed. Naomi broke the silence. A slow, dangerous smirk spread across her striking face. She reached into her briefcase, pulled out a duplicate copy of the exact proxy agreement David had just taken, and tossed it onto the mattress. "Give that man an Academy Award for supreme arrogance." Naomi laughed, her voice ringing with dark, triumphant satisfaction. "He was so eager to secure those voting rights and strip your power that he completely violated the cardinal rule of corporate acquisitions." Never sign a document without letting your legal counsel review the fine print first. Ryan stepped away from his encrypted monitors, a fierce grin lighting up his face. He walked over to the bed, pointing a finger at the dense legal jargon printed on the fourth page of the proxy agreement. Naomi opened the document and smoothed the page flat. As a senior corporate attorney, she specialized in drafting contracts that functioned like invisible bear traps. David believed he had forced me to sign a standard marital proxy transfer. He believed he had stripped me of my voting rights. He was entirely unaware that the document I just signed was heavily modified by one of the most ruthless legal minds in the country. Right here in Section 4, Paragraph B, Naomi pointed out her manicured nail tapping sharply against the paper. I legally embedded a comprehensive moral turpitude and asset clawback provision. It is buried deep within the indemnification clauses. By forcing you to sign this proxy, and by accepting the transfer of your voting shares under his direct executive authority, David just legally bound his own personal estate to any future corporate fraud discoveries. I smiled, feeling a cold wave of absolute victory wash over me. In standard corporate structures, a chief executive officer is often protected by limited liability. If a company goes bankrupt, the executive personal wealth is usually shielded from the fallout. But Naomi had drafted a lethal exception. The clause specifically stated that if the majority shareholder acting under proxy was found guilty of embezzlement, wire fraud, or moral turpitude, the protective corporate veil would be completely pierced. He just tied a concrete block to his own ankles, I said, staring at the dense legal text. Exactly, Naomi confirmed, her dark eyes gleaming with anticipation. He thought he was taking your voting power. Instead, he just legally consented to complete personal financial liquidation. The second the Securities and Exchange Commission uncovers the $4 million he funneled to the Cayman Islands and the Aspen Mansion, this contract guarantees that the federal government and the defrauded investors can seize everything he owns. His bank accounts, his cars, his personal real estate. Everything is collateral for his crimes. David had walked out of the hospital suite feeling victorious, clutching the very document that guaranteed his absolute destruction. He had handed us the blade, and we had just placed it directly against his throat. While we secured the legal snare around David from the safety of the hospital suite, the psychological warfare against his accomplice was already in motion. Across the city at the corporate headquarters, Savannah sat in her pristine corner office. She was nursing a cup of artisanal coffee, desperately trying to maintain the polished, untouchable image of a successful public relations director. Her nerves were entirely frayed. The trauma of the elevator crash, combined with the sudden, inexplicable arrival of federal subpoenas for David, had left her jumping at shadows. She furiously applied concealer under her eyes, preparing for a morning press briefing to hype up the initial public offering. A sharp knock on the frosted glass of her office door made her jolt. A private courier stepped inside. He did not wear the standard delivery uniform. He was dressed in an immaculate charcoal suit, moving with a silent, intimidating efficiency. He bypassed her assistant entirely, stepped up to her mahogany desk, and placed a thick, sealed black envelope directly over her keyboard. He required no signature. He simply turned and vanished down the bustling executive hallway before Savannah could even ask who sent it. Her hands trembled as she reached for the heavy envelope. There was no return address, no corporate logo. She slid a silver letter opener under the flap and pulled out the contents. The air completely left her lungs. The first document was a formal notification from the Internal Revenue Service. It was not a standard tax inquiry. It was a high-priority criminal audit mandate. The dense, threatening legal text specifically cited unexplained wealth and flagrant tax evasion connected to the purchase of a luxury estate in Aspen, Colorado. Savannah felt a cold sweat break out across her neck. The document explicitly named her as the sole managing director of the offshore holding entity that purchased the property. It demanded immediate forfeiture of financial records to justify the $4 million transaction. The federal government was not asking David for the money. They were coming directly for her. Her breathing grew shallow and erratic. She frantically pulled the second item from the black envelope. It was an 8x10 high-definition photograph printed on glossy paper. Savannah stared at the image in absolute, paralyzing horror. The photograph captured her and David walking through the sunlit entrance of an exclusive private bank in the Cayman Islands. The timestamp in the bottom corner marked the exact date and minute they had finalized the fraudulent wire transfers. The camera angle was perfect, capturing both of their faces with undeniable clarity. The psychological strike was devastatingly precise. Savannah was not an accountant, but she possessed enough survival instinct to understand exactly what she was looking at. David had orchestrated the entire embezzlement scheme, but he had cleverly insulated himself. He had convinced Savannah to put her name on the shell companies, framing it as a romantic gesture, a way to build her personal wealth. Now staring at the federal audit notice, the romantic illusion violently shattered. She was not his partner. She was his designated fall guy. If the federal authorities descended on the company, the paper trail led straight to her front door. She would be the one facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary while David claimed ignorance. Panic, raw and unfiltered, propelled her out of her chair. She grabbed the document, sprinting down the executive corridor toward the chief executive suite. She bypassed his secretary, shoving the heavy double doors open with enough force to crack the wood against the wall. David was standing behind his massive desk, completely absorbed in a glowing array of financial monitors. He was reviewing the latest projected valuation models for the initial public offering. The panic of the previous night seemed to have entirely evaporated, replaced by a manic, toxic arrogance. He was riding the high of having secured my signature on the voting proxy. He believed he had neutralized his only major threat. Savannah slammed the IRS audit and the Cayman Islands photograph directly onto his keyboard. Her chest heaved as she fought to draw breath. She pointed a shaking finger at the federal seal on the document. "Look at this," Savannah hissed, her voice vibrating with sheer terror. "Someone knows. Someone followed us. The federal government is auditing the Aspen House, David. They have my name on everything. They are coming for me. You need to fix this right now." David barely glanced at the papers. He let out a long, irritated sigh, annoyed that his triumphant morning was being interrupted. He picked up the photograph, inspected it for 2 seconds, and tossed it carelessly back onto the desk. "You are being completely hysterical, Savannah," David said, his tone dripping with condescending exasperation. "It is just an automated tax inquiry. Some algorithm flagged the offshore transfer. We will hire a tax attorney to bury them in paperwork until after the bell rings on the NASDAQ next week. Once the company goes public, we will have enough liquid capital to pay whatever fines they want." Savannah stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Did you even look at the photograph, David? Someone hired a private investigator to follow us to the Caribbean. Someone sent this to my office to terrorize me. I am the managing director of that shell company. If the board of directors sees this, I go to federal prison." David stepped around the desk and grabbed her shoulders. His grip was entirely too tight, bordering on painful. He looked down at her with cold, empty eyes. The charming facade she had fallen in love with peeled away, revealing the sociopath underneath. "You need to calm down and act like a professional," David commanded sharply. "I handled my wife yesterday. I got her to sign over all her voting shares. I have absolute control of this company now. No one can touch me. You are going to go back to your office, put on a smile, and sell this initial public offering to the media. If you panic and ruin my valuation, I swear I will let them throw you to the wolves. Do you understand me?" Savannah felt the blood drain from her face. The fracture in their relationship was instantaneous and permanent. In that chilling moment, looking into the eyes of the man who had promised her the world, she saw her own inevitable destruction. He did not care about her safety. He did not care about the federal audit. He only cared about his stock valuation and his own power. He had gladly sacrificed his pregnant wife in a burning elevator shaft just to save his own skin, and Savannah finally realized she was next in line on the chopping block. The romance was dead. The partnership was a lie. As David turned his back on her to admire his financial projections again, Savannah backed out of the office. Pure, desperate survival instinct took over her mind. She knew he would never save her, which meant she had to find a way to save herself, even if it meant tearing his entire empire down from the inside to survive. Savannah stumbled back to her office, locking the door behind her. She spent 2 hours pacing her expensive rug, staring at the Cayman Islands photograph. David's words echoed in her mind. He was going to let her take the fall. The luxury dinners and the promotion were a down payment on her future incarceration. She needed him to admit his involvement. She needed him to say out loud that he orchestrated the offshore accounts. She checked his digital calendar. David had blocked out the executive boardroom for a private afternoon session to review the final public offering presentation. It was the perfect place to corner him. Savannah marched down the corridor. She pushed open the heavy mahogany doors of the boardroom. David stood at the head of the massive obsidian table, clicking through slides on a laser projector. "I told you I am busy," David snapped. "We are 48 hours away from locking in the institutional investors. Get out!" Savannah slammed her hands down on the table. "I am not going anywhere," she shouted. "You are not going to pin the Aspen property on me. You will tell your legal team you set up those shell companies. You are going to take the blame for the tax evasion." David let out a harsh laugh. He clicked the projector off, plunging the room into shadows before turning the overhead lights on. "I am not doing anything of the sort," David replied. "Your signature is on the Cayman Bank files. You happily accepted the title of managing director. You enjoyed the private jets and luxury lifestyle. You do not get to play the innocent victim now just because the federal government is asking for receipts." Savannah felt her chest heave with uncontainable fury. "I only signed those papers because you told me it was a tax shelter. I did not know you were stealing capital directly from the startup investors." David leaned in, pressing her against the table. "Grow up," he sneered. "Where did you think $4 million came from my salary? You knew exactly what we were doing. You were greedy. I am the chief executive officer. I am legally insulated. My lawyers will paint you as a manipulative gold digger who embezzled corporate funds to finance her lifestyle. Who do you think a jury will believe, the visionary founder, or the girl sleeping with her boss?" Savannah shoved him backward with all her strength. "You arrogant monster!" She screamed, her voice reaching a hysterical pitch that pierced through the soundproof walls. "I did not forge those wire transfers, you did. You bypassed the secondary approvals. You authorized the release of $4 million from the Core Development Fund into the offshore accounts. I watched you type the authorization codes yourself." David lunged forward, grabbing her by the arms. "Keep your voice down, you stupid girl," he growled, shaking her violently. "You have no proof. I wiped the server logs months ago. There is no digital footprint tying me to those authorizations. It is your word against mine, and your word means nothing." Savannah shoved him away. "We will see what the federal auditors have to say about that," she spat before turning and running out of the boardroom, leaving the heavy doors swinging in her wake. David stood alone in the center of the room, straightening his tie and smoothing his suit jacket. He let out a long breath, confident that Savannah possessed no real leverage. He walked back to the projector, convinced his digital tracks were permanently erased. He was wrong. The boardroom was indeed built with acoustic soundproofing designed to keep corporate secrets strictly inside the room. But David had forgotten a crucial architectural detail. The boardroom shared a ventilation shaft and a direct adjoining door with the office of the chief financial officer. Mitchell sat perfectly still in his darkened office just on the other side of that adjoining door. He had deliberately left the connecting door cracked open by a fraction of an inch before David arrived. Sitting on his desk, positioned directly beside the gap, was a digital audio recorder. Mitchell reached out and pressed the stop button. A green light blinked, confirming that the file was securely saved. He had captured every single second of the volatile confrontation in crystal-clear high-definition audio. He had Savannah screaming the exact words they needed. "I did not forge those wire transfers, you did." More devastatingly, he captured David's arrogant confession. David openly admitted on tape that he wiped the server logs to hide the release of $4 million into offshore accounts. He had explicitly confessed to wire fraud, embezzlement, and obstruction of justice, while boasting about framing his mistress. Mitchell plugged the recording device into his encrypted laptop. He did not smile. He did not celebrate. He simply executed his role with the cold, calculating precision I had hired him for. He opened a secure, untraceable communication channel linked directly to our hospital war room. He uploaded the audio file, added an encryption key, and hit send. Within seconds, the file materialized on Ryan's monitors in the medical suite. Naomi plugged in a pair of studio headphones and listened to the explosive argument. When the recording finished, she slowly removed the headphones and looked across the hospital bed at me. The final piece of the puzzle had just clicked perfectly into place. We possess the digital footprint from the backdoor audit. We possess the lethal proxy agreement bearing his signature. And now, thanks to Mitchell's flawless execution, we possess the definitive, irrefutable audio confession required by the federal authorities to secure a criminal indictment. David had spent his entire afternoon threatening the women in his life, fully convinced that his corporate power made him completely untouchable by the law. He had no idea that his own reckless arrogance had just handed our legal team the absolute undeniable power required to legally execute his entire tech empire and permanently end his stolen freedom. With the criminal evidence secured, Naomi immediately pivoted our strategy toward the corporate battlefield. David's impending initial public offering was the crown jewel of his arrogant ambition. He believed the ringing of the Nasdaq bell would cement his legacy and permanently insulate his wealth. We were going to shatter that illusion from the inside out, turning his own board of directors into the architects of his immediate downfall. The public relations team at his startup had spent the last 48 hours aggressively spinning the elevator accident to the media. They painted David as a tragic hero who made agonizing decisions under impossible circumstances. The financial press was eating it up. His carefully manufactured image was inflating the pre-market valuation of the company, setting the stage for a massive stock debut. Naomi opened her encrypted laptop and accessed a highly secure server. During Ryan's digital infiltration of the corporate network, he had not just pulled financial records, he had also mirrored the building's internal security mainframe. Naomi clicked on a specific high-definition video file. It was the unedited raw footage from the hidden security camera mounted in the corner of the elevator ceiling. The camera had been equipped with infrared night vision, cutting straight through the heavy black smoke that had filled the shaft. Every gruesome, cowardly detail was captured in terrifying clarity. Naomi drafted a sterile, anonymous email addressed directly to the private board of directors and the lead institutional underwriters handling the public offering. The subject line read simply, "Urgent Fiduciary Risk Assessment. Executive Misconduct Evidence Attached." With a single keystroke, she sent the encrypted video file directly into the heavily guarded inboxes of the most powerful financial backers in Seattle. Across the city, in penthouse offices and secure conference rooms, billionaires and venture capitalists opened the attachment. They expected to see minor accounting discrepancies or a disgruntled employee complaint. Instead, they watched in high-definition horror as the true nature of their chief executive officer was laid bare. The board members watched the infrared footage of the elevator plunging. They watched the 8 hours of agonizing waiting. But the truly damning moment came during the rescue. The board watched utterly repulsed as the top hatch was pried open by the firefighters. They saw the clear, indisputable moment when David violently shoved his 7-month pregnant wife backward against the steel wall. They watched him haul his young public relations director toward the escape hatch, feeding a frantic lie to the rescue team. And finally, they witnessed the ultimate act of depravity. They saw David's heavy leather shoe lash out brutally, kicking his pregnant wife in the shoulder to propel himself out of the burning cabin, leaving her bleeding on the floor. The reaction within the financial syndicate was instantaneous and utterly explosive. Wall Street investors do not care about marital fidelity, but they care deeply about public relations disasters and catastrophic liabilities. A chief executive officer caught on tape violently trampling his pregnant wife to save his mistress is a radioactive asset. It was an extinction-level public relations crisis waiting to detonate. If that footage leaked to the mainstream media after the company went public, the stock price would plummet to zero, wiping out billions in shareholder value. The institutional backers did not wait for explanations. They did not call David to ask for his side of the story. They immediately triggered their emergency withdrawal protocols. By the time the markets opened the following morning, the financial bleed had officially begun. Major underwriters started quietly pulling their committed backing. Private equity firms canceled their preliminary buy-in orders. The Whisper network in the financial district caught fire, spreading rumors of massive executive instability. David was sitting in his corner office going over the final press tour schedule when his customized financial terminal began flashing red. The proprietary algorithms tracking his pre-initial public offering valuation updated in real time. The numbers spiraled downward at a sickening pace. Within 3 hours, his company's valuation plummeted by a staggering 30%. Hundreds of millions of dollars in projected market capitalization simply evaporated into thin air. He frantically smashed the intercom button on his desk, shouting for his secretary to get the lead underwriters on the phone. Every single call went straight to voicemail. His frantic emails to the board of directors were met with cold, automated out-of-office replies. The silence from his financial backers was deafening. Panic finally seized David's chest. Without the institutional backing, the initial public offering would collapse before he ever reached the trading floor. He would be left holding a massive corporate debt with absolutely no way to pay out his early investors. He paced his office, his mind racing through desperate scenarios. He ordered his remaining finance team to begin securing emergency bridge funding to cover the sudden capital deficit. He spent the entire afternoon making frantic, sweating phone calls to shadow equity firms offering them exorbitant interest rates and massive chunks of corporate control, just to keep his sinking ship afloat. He was willing to sign away the very soul of his company to maintain the illusion of success. Sitting in my quiet hospital suite, I watched his desperate maneuvers unfold on Ryan's tracking monitors. David was bleeding out financially frantically, trying to plug the holes in a sinking hull. He was negotiating terrible deals, taking on toxic debt, and completely compromising his future. He genuinely believed he was fighting the ruthless mechanics of the free market. He was completely unaware that he was actually dancing on a string. He had no idea that the shadow firms he was begging for capital were entirely controlled by my blind trust. I was pulling every single string in the dark, tightening the noose around his neck, preparing for the final, fatal snap to echo through the entire corporate world. He was a dead man walking. His stolen empire was finally crumbling right before his eyes. The morning after the institutional investors initiated their quiet exodus, the atmosphere inside the startup headquarters was suffocating. David was operating on lethal doses of espresso and unfiltered panic. His usually pristine, custom-tailored suit was violently wrinkled, and heavy dark circles shadowed his eyes. He had spent the entire night barricaded in his executive suite, screaming at his wealth managers and frantically calling every private equity contact in his phone. They all gave him the exact same hollow excuses, claiming the market was too volatile or their investment windows were currently closed. The financial sector possessed a hive mind, and the silent consensus was that David had become a toxic liability. He was entirely isolated, bleeding capital at a catastrophic rate and staring down the barrel of an absolutely humiliating public collapse. With his options entirely exhausted, David authorized his finance team to reach out to a shadowy, aggressive holding firm known for providing emergency bridge loans to distressed assets. The firm operated under a generic corporate umbrella, a faceless entity that swooped in when traditional banks slammed their doors. David scheduled an emergency video conference for 10 in the morning, desperate to secure a massive cash injection to stabilize his valuation before the initial public offering roadshow concluded. He positioned himself at the head of the obsidian boardroom table, adjusting his collar and forcing a confident, arrogant smile onto his face as the video call connected. On the massive high-definition screen, David faced 3 elite corporate attorneys representing the holding firm. They sat in a sterile gray conference room, their expressions completely devoid of any emotion. David immediately launched into his practiced pitch. He utilized all the charismatic buzzwords that had successfully charmed venture capitalists in the past. He talked about market disruption, exponential user acquisition, and unprecedented revenue projections. He painted the sudden drop in his valuation as a minor temporary market correction, a brief hiccup before his software revolutionized the industry. He projected absolute dominance, gesturing wildly and promising them an astronomical return on their investment if they provided the emergency bridge capital today. The lead attorney on the screen did not smile. He simply pulled a thick legal binder toward him and cut David off mid-sentence. The attorney stated in a cold, metallic voice that they were fully aware of his sudden lack of institutional backing. They knew his valuation had plummeted by 30% overnight. They were not interested in his visionary speeches or his inflated revenue projections. They were only interested in hard, predatory leverage. The attorney presented the term sheet, and the conditions were absolutely brutal. The holding firm offered the exact capital injection David needed to keep the initial public offering alive, but the cost of that capital was staggering. The loan carried an exorbitant punishing interest rate. More devastatingly, it was structured as a highly aggressive convertible debt instrument. If the company's stock fell below a specific threshold, or if any executive misconduct triggered a regulatory review, the debt would instantly convert into commanding equity. Furthermore, to secure the funds today, David had to sign over a massive chunk of his personal founder shares at a valuation that was slashed by 60%. It was financial extortion. The contract was explicitly designed to strip him of his company the moment he stumbled. David sat in the empty boardroom staring at the digital contract glowing on his tablet. Sweat beaded on his forehead, tracking down the side of his face. He knew he was making a deal with the devil. He knew the terms were practically suicidal for a chief executive officer, but his monumental ego completely blinded him to the danger. He could not stomach the idea of canceling the initial public offering. He could not face the humiliation of walking onto the trading floor as a failure. He convinced himself that he was a genius, that he could easily outmaneuver these faceless lawyers once the public market cash flooded his accounts next week. Driven by pure, unadulterated hubris, David picked up his stylus. He signed his name on the digital dotted line, legally surrendering the absolute control of his company for a fleeting illusion of survival. Miles away in the secure isolation of my hospital suite, the final digital signature registered on our encrypted monitors with a sharp, confirming ping. Naomi let out a deep, resonant laugh that filled the room. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms over her emerald green suit, staring at the captured document. Ryan grinned, typing a rapid sequence of commands to lock the legal transfer into our heavily guarded servers. I sat up against my pillows, a profound, chilling sense of victory settling over my bruised body. David had no idea who he just pitched to. He had no idea who those ruthless attorneys actually worked for. The shadowy holding firm that just purchased his toxic debt was not some random group of predatory investors. The firm was a subsidiary of the Vanguard Angel Fund. It was entirely controlled, funded, and operated by my own secure blind trust. I was the puppet master sitting in the dark. I watched the live feed of his desperate boardroom pitch, listening to him beg for capital from the very woman he had kicked and abandoned in a burning elevator shaft. By signing that predatory convertible debt agreement, David had formally handed me the absolute keys to his kingdom. I already owned the original seed funding that built his software. Through Naomi's brilliant proxy trap, I legally bound his personal estate to his impending criminal charges. And now, through this emergency bridge loan, I owned his massive debt and his foundational equity. I held his entire financial existence in the palm of my hand. David walked out of his boardroom, wiping the sweat from his brow, exhaling a massive breath of relief. He genuinely believed he had just saved his empire. He believed he had outsmarted the market and secured his path to becoming a billionaire. He was completely oblivious to the reality that he had just constructed his own inescapable prison. He had traded his soul for a lifeline that was tightly wrapped around his throat. The initial public offering would proceed exactly as he planned, but it would no longer be a celebration of his tech genius. It was going to be the grand, very public stage for his spectacular execution, and I was going to be the one holding the axe. The morning of the initial public offering dawned crisp and clear over the Seattle skyline. David had rented out a massive, opulent grand hall in the heart of the financial district to host a remote NASDAQ bell-ringing ceremony. He spared absolutely no expense for his moment of supreme triumph. A sprawling red carpet stretched from the sleek glass entrance all the way to the curb, flanked by velvet ropes and towering floral arrangements of white orchids. A fleet of black luxury utility vehicles lined the street, dropping off the remaining board members, minor investors, and a swarm of Wall Street journalists who had flown in specifically to cover the highly anticipated tech debut. Inside the grand hall, the atmosphere was thick with the intoxicating scent of expensive cologne and unlimited wealth. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos circulated smoothly through the growing crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with crystal champagne flutes and imported caviar. A massive digital marquee dominated the front wall of the venue, displaying the company logo and a countdown clock ticking down to the exact moment the market would officially open. David stood at the center of the room, practically vibrating with manic energy. He was dressed in a brand-new custom-tailored charcoal suit that cost more than most people earned in a year. His hair was perfectly styled, erasing any trace of the desperate, sweating man who had frantically signed away his company just 48 hours prior. He held a flute of vintage champagne clinking glasses with financial reporters and boasting loudly about his visionary leadership. He regaled the journalists with highly sanitized, entirely fabricated stories of his relentless grind and singular genius. He painted himself as a titan of industry, a man who had weathered every storm through sheer, unbreakable willpower. He completely believed his own lies. The emergency bridge loan he had secured from my shadowy holding firm was tucked away in his mind as a brilliant tactical victory, a minor sacrifice that had successfully propelled him to the finish line. He felt completely untouchable, convinced he had outsmarted the institutional investors who had cowardly pulled their backing. Standing right beside him, bathing in the glow of the camera flashes, was Savannah. She wore a stunning form-fitting crimson designer dress that screamed power and new money. Her hair and makeup had been done by an elite styling team hired specifically for the media coverage. Despite the lingering cold terror from the federal audit notice she had received days earlier, Savannah forced a radiant, practiced smile onto her face. She leaned into David, playing the role of the vital, indispensable public relations director. She watched the flashes of the cameras, convincing herself that the incoming flood of public market capital would simply wash away all her legal problems. She believed David's arrogant assurances that he would deploy a team of tax attorneys to bury the federal investigation. In her mind, she was just minutes away from crossing the threshold into the elite billionaire class where the rules of normal society simply no longer applied. They stood together on the elevated podium, a picture-perfect monument to greed and deception. Mitchell stood quietly near the edge of the podium, holding his own glass of sparkling water. As the chief financial officer, his presence was required for the media optics. He wore his usual sharp, understated suit, his expression a mask of absolute professional neutrality. David threw an arm around Mitchell's shoulder, pulling him into a photograph, and loudly praising him as the best numbers guy in the business. Mitchell allowed the photograph, offering a polite, tight-lipped smile for the cameras. He did not flinch. He did not give away the slightest hint of the devastating financial bombs currently sitting in his briefcase. Mitchell knew exactly what was about to happen. He knew that the very investors shaking David's hand were about to watch their capital evaporate. He simply checked his watch, calculating the final minutes remaining in David's hollow reign. The crowd grew louder as the countdown clock on the massive digital board dropped below the 10-minute mark. The energy in the grand hall reached a fever pitch. Financial analysts stood ready with their tablets, preparing to broadcast the opening stock price to the world. David stepped up to the primary microphone positioned directly under the glowing corporate logo. He tapped the microphone, silencing the murmuring crowd. He launched into a grand, sweeping speech about innovation, courage, and the future of technology. He thanked his dedicated team, entirely omitting any mention of the wife who had actually funded the foundational code. He thanked Savannah by name, calling her the voice of the company, while the reporters frantically took notes. The sheer level of self-congratulatory delusion echoing through the hall was staggering. He was putting on a masterclass in narcissistic manipulation, soaking in the adulation of a room full of people he was actively defrauding. I monitored the live feed of his speech from a secure luxury transport vehicle, idling just 2 blocks away from the venue. Naomi sat beside me, smoothing the lapels of her sharp legal suit, her eyes fixed on the streaming video on her tablet. Ryan sat in the front passenger seat, communicating quietly through an earpiece with his private security detail already positioned around the perimeter of the Grand Hall. David's voice rang out through the digital feed, dripping with absolute triumph. He raised his champagne flute high into the air, toasting to the future, toasting to himself. The crowd erupted into thunderous applause. Savannah beamed beside him, placing a hand on his arm, visualizing the mountain mansion in Aspen that she thought was safely hers. They were entirely wrapped in their delusion, blinded by the flashing lights and the intoxicating roar of the crowd. They truly believed they had won the ultimate prize. They believed they had successfully discarded me in the ashes of that burning elevator shaft and climbed to the absolute pinnacle of the corporate world without a single consequence. The countdown clock dropped to exactly 5 minutes. It was time for the Queen to arrive. The heavy oak doors at the back of the Grand Hall burst apart with a resounding crash that echoed over the murmuring crowd. Every head in the cavernous room snapped toward the entrance. The blinding flashbulbs of the financial press halted, capturing the silhouette of a woman framed in the sudden flood of daylight from the lobby. I stepped over the threshold, bringing the bitter wind of the Seattle morning into the stifling heat of David's manufactured celebration. I was no longer the broken, weeping woman he had kicked to the floor of a burning elevator shaft. I was a senior forensic auditor, and I had come to collect my debts. I wore a sharply tailored midnight blue power suit that commanded absolute respect. The fabric perfectly accommodated my 7-month baby bump, transforming my pregnancy from a point of vulnerability into a display of undeniable strength. My posture was rigid, my chin was high. I stared straight down the center aisle, locking my eyes onto the man standing paralyzed on the podium. Behind me walked Naomi and Ryan. They flanked my sides like a lethal royal guard. Naomi clutched a thick black leather briefcase against her emerald suit, her face an unreadable mask of corporate execution. Ryan moved with predatory military grace, his eyes scanning the crowd and neutralizing any potential physical threats. The grand hall descended into absolute suffocating silence. The ambient chatter died instantly. The soft jazz music playing over the sound system seemed to fade away. The only sound left in the room was the rhythmic, deliberate click of my heels striking the polished marble floor as I marched down the length of the red carpet. The sea of wealthy investors, venture capitalists, and Wall Street journalists parted instinctively, creating a wide path for my approach. They did not know who I was, but the sheer radiating authority of my entrance communicated that I owned the room. Up on the elevated podium, David froze completely. The triumphant smile literally melted off his face, replaced by a pale mask of sheer terror. The microphone slipped slightly in his sweating grip. He stared at me as if he were looking at a ghost crawling out of a grave. In his mind, I was supposed to be hiding away in some hospital bed, quietly crying over our broken marriage. I was supposed to be terrified of his threats. The sight of me marching toward his stage, flanked by a high-powered attorney and a private security expert, completely shattered his reality. Savannah shrank back against the digital marquee. Her crimson designer dress suddenly looked cheap under the harsh glare of the camera lights. The terror from the anonymous federal audit notice she had received days earlier flared up in her eyes. She recognized Naomi's expensive legal attire and immediately understood that this was not a desperate wife crashing a party to make a scene. This was a highly calculated legal siege. Savannah took a step away from David, her survival instinct kicking in as she desperately tried to distance herself. The journalists smelled blood in the water. The financial press corps, sensing a catastrophic corporate scandal unfolding live, pivoted their heavy broadcast cameras away from the podium and pointed them directly at me. Flashbulbs erupted like rapid-fire explosions, capturing every step of my relentless march down the aisle. The countdown clock on the massive screen behind David ticked down to 4 minutes. The timing was absolutely flawless. I was going to ruin his legacy mere seconds before he could secure his billionaire status. David began to hyperventilate. The walls of his carefully constructed empire were closing in. He looked frantically at the institutional investors standing in the front row, noticing their expressions shifting from celebratory to highly suspicious. He needed to stop me before I reached the stage. Driven by desperate self-preservation, David gripped the podium with white knuckles and leaned into the microphone. He forced a calm, sympathetic smile onto his sweating face, playing the role of the tragic husband. He cleared his throat, but the sound echoed with a pathetic tremor. He covered the microphone with his hand, leaning his head to the side to speak directly to the venue security team stationed near the front of the stage. He hissed into the microphone, projecting a frantic whisper that was still entirely audible to the reporters standing directly below the podium. "Security, remove this woman from the premises immediately!" David ordered, his voice cracking with panic. "Do not let her get anywhere near this stage. She is my estranged wife, and she is currently experiencing a severe mental health crisis. She is completely delusional and needs medical attention. Escort her out before she hurts herself." It was his classic, predictable maneuver. When faced with a threat, David immediately resorted to gaslighting. He tried to weaponize my pregnancy and my trauma, attempting to paint me as a hysterical, unstable woman to discredit whatever I was about to say. He expected the burly security guards to rush forward, grab my arms, and drag me out of the building while he sighed apologetically to the press. He fully expected his authority as the chief executive officer to grant him absolute control over the venue. 4 massive corporate security guards immediately stepped onto the bright red carpet, moving to block my path. David let out a heavy sigh of relief, believing he had successfully neutralized the threat. He was absolutely certain he had won the standoff. But I did not stop walking forward. I kept my eyes firmly locked on David, my expression hardening into a look of absolute terrifying certainty. I continued my slow march straight toward the wall of security guards, knowing with absolute conviction that they would never lay a single finger on me. David had no idea that his absolute authority in this spectacular building was already totally dead, and the dramatic standoff was about to end in his complete, publicly televised humiliation today. The 4 massive corporate security guards closed in their broad shoulders, forming a solid human barricade across the red carpet. They moved with military precision, hands reaching out to grab my arms and forcefully escort me out of the grand hall. Up on the podium, David let out a ragged breath of relief. His chest visibly deflated as he watched his hired muscle move in to eliminate the problem. He actually adjusted his tie, ready to resume his charming public relations smile for the flashing cameras. He thought the crisis was averted. He thought he was still the king of the castle. He was wrong. From the edge of the elevated stage, Mitchell stepped out of the shadows. The chief financial officer moved with a calm, calculated authority that instantly demanded attention. He did not yell, he did not panic. Mitchell simply raised one hand, his palm facing outward toward the advancing security team. A single silent gesture. The effect was immediate and absolute. The 4 guards stopped dead in their tracks. They lowered their hands and stepped back seamlessly, parting down the middle to clear the path. In the corporate world, loyalty belongs to the person who signs the paychecks. Mitchell controlled the payroll, and Mitchell knew exactly who actually funded the company. David gripped the edges of the wooden podium, his knuckles turning stark white. His eyes darted wildly between the security team and his chief financial officer. He leaned into the microphone, his voice a frantic, desperate hiss. "What are you doing?" David demanded, completely abandoning his polished persona. "I gave you a direct order. Remove that woman from the building right now. She is trespassing. Get her out of here." Mitchell did not even look at David. He kept his eyes locked respectfully on me, lowering his head in a slight, acknowledging nod. The security guards crossed their arms and stood down, entirely transforming from David's personal enforcers into a ceremonial guard for my arrival. I resumed my march. The The sound of my heels striking the marble floor echoed through the cavernous hall like the ticking of an execution timer. I reached the base of the podium steps. Ryan moved to the bottom of the staircase, folding his arms across his chest and planting his feet firmly to secure the perimeter. Naomi walked right up the steps beside me, her emerald green suit flashing under the relentless glare of the television lights. I ascended the stairs slowly, deliberately. I felt the weight of the past 3 years lifting off my shoulders with every upward step. The late nights poring over forensic spreadsheets to keep his company afloat, the agonizing fertility treatments, the suffocating terror of waking up in a burning, crashing elevator shaft alone. All of it fueled my ascent. I was not walking up to a stage. I was walking up to an altar of reckoning. I reached the top of the platform and stepped directly into David's personal space. The height difference between us suddenly felt entirely irrelevant. He tried to stand his ground, trying to puff out his chest and project dominance, but his body betrayed him. He was trembling. I could see the rapid, terrified pulse beating frantically in his neck. He smelled like fear masked by expensive cologne. Savannah pressed her back flat against the massive digital marquee, trying to make herself invisible. Her crimson designer dress clashed violently with her pale, terrified complexion. She recognized Naomi's expensive legal attire and immediately understood that this was not a desperate wife crashing a party. Her eyes darted toward the exit, calculating her chances of slipping out of the grand hall unnoticed. Naomi tracked Savannah's movement with a predatory glare, silently communicating that there was absolutely no escape for the public relations manager today. I stepped right in front of the microphone stand. David gripped the metal stem with both hands, trying to physically bar me from addressing the room. His eyes pleaded with me, a pathetic, silent begging that disgusted me to my very core. He was still trying to manipulate me with pity. "Claire, please, David," whispered his voice cracking horribly. "Do not do this. We can talk about everything at home. Just walk away." I reached out and wrapped my hand around the microphone. My grip was unyielding. I stared directly into his terrified, shifting eyes. I did not blink. I did not soften. I ripped the microphone forcefully out of his sweaty hands. The sudden feedback screeched over the sound system, forcing several board members in the front row to cover their ears. I turned my body, positioning myself squarely at the center of the podium. The sea of Wall Street journalists, angel investors, and corporate partners stared up at me in absolute bewilderment. The flashing cameras had stopped. The entire room held its collective breath, waiting for the bomb to drop. I looked out over this crowd, letting the heavy, suffocating silence stretch for a long, agonizing moment. Then I lifted the microphone to my lips. My voice rang out through the grand hall, crisp, sharp, and echoing with unassailable authority. "You cannot order security to remove the primary stakeholder of this company, David." The words slammed into the grand hall like a physical shockwave. The room fell dead silent. A pin drop would have sounded like a gunshot. The Wall Street reporters froze, their pens hovering over their notepads. The institutional investors in the front row stiffened in their tailored suits, their eyes widening in sudden, horrific comprehension. The narrative they had been fed for months was instantly shredded. David let out a choked, suffocated gasp. He staggered backward, literally stumbling away from me as if I had shoved him. He bumped into the digital marquee, his mouth hanging open. His brain desperately tried to process the impossible sentence I had just spoken. Stakeholder. Primary stakeholder. The words short-circuited his arrogant mind. The silence held for exactly 3 seconds, then absolute chaos erupted. The financial press corps exploded. 50 reporters started shouting over each other, desperately demanding clarification. Camera flashes turned the grand hall into a blinding strobe light of white-hot panic. Cell phones were whipped out as industry insiders frantically dialed their trading desks. The board of directors leaped out of their plush velvet chairs, demanding answers from the frozen, hyperventilating man on the stage. I stood perfectly still in the center of the storm. I let the chaos wash over the room, watching David's glorious billionaire debut disintegrate into a spectacular public catastrophe. This was the moment I had built in the dark. The trap was finally sprung. He had lost absolutely everything before he even realized it was all gone. I let the pandemonium rage for a full minute. The flashing cameras, the shouting reporters, the panicked board members demanding answers from the sweating man trapped against the digital marquee. Then I leaned back into the microphone. My voice did not need to be loud to cut through the noise. It carried the chilling weight of absolute certainty. I simply asked for the room to quiet down, and like obedient soldiers, the financial press corps instantly fell silent. The heavy oak doors remained sealed by Ryan and his security team. Nobody was leaving this grand hall until I finished my execution. "My name is Claire," I announced, ensuring every single recording device captured my words with perfect clarity. For the past 5 years, I have been known to the public strictly as David's wife. I have played the role of the quiet, supportive spouse standing in the background of his magazine covers. But in the corporate registry, and more importantly, in the federal tax records, I hold a very different title. I turned my gaze away from the reporters and locked eyes with the board of directors sitting in the front row. Their expensive suits could not hide their visible trembling. 3 years ago, this startup was hemorrhaging capital. I continued pacing slowly across the stage. You were weeks away from total insolvency. Your creditors were circling, and your prototype software was crashing. Then a miracle happened. An anonymous entity known as the Vanguard Angel Fund swooped in with a $15 million injection. That money saved your operations, secured your server space, and paid the salaries of every person standing in this room. David stood before you and took all the credit. He told you his brilliant pitching skills had secured the investment of a lifetime. I turned to look at David. He was shaking his head in slow, jerky movements, his brain violently rejecting the reality unfolding before him. He lied. I stated, my voice echoing like a gavel striking wood. There was no brilliant pitch. There was no boardroom negotiation. I am the sole controller of the Vanguard Angel Fund. I authorized that $15 million wire transfer from my private blind trust because I believed in my husband. I built the financial foundation of this entire empire while he took the applause. Gasps rippled through the audience. Journalists furiously typed on their smartphones, verifying the corporate registrations in real time. The brilliant visionary chief executive officer was entirely funded by his supposedly boring accountant wife. But I did not just provide the money, I said, shifting my attention to the technology reporters in the crowd. David likes to claim he is a software genius. He likes to tell the press that he coded the foundational algorithm in our garage. That is another convenient fiction. I am a forensic auditor by trade, which means I understand complex data architecture better than anyone. I wrote the core algorithm that processes your financial data. I hold the sole exclusive intellectual property rights to the source code. David finally found his voice, a pathetic, high-pitched squeak of desperation. "You are lying," he choked out, clutching his chest. "The company owns the code. We filed the patents." I smiled, a cold, predatory expression that made him flinch. "You filed patents for the user interface, David, but you never owned the engine driving the car. I licensed the core algorithm to this company under a strict 3-year usage agreement. That agreement had an automatic renewal clause, provided the chief executive officer physically signed the extension forms. Those were the tax documents I brought to the office on the day of the elevator crash. You were too busy kissing your mistress to read them, and too arrogant to sign them properly. The license officially expired at midnight. As of this morning, I legally own 60% of your entire operational infrastructure, and you are currently running unlicensed stolen software." The lead underwriter from the investment bank stood up, his face drained of all color. He looked at David with pure, unadulterated rage. "You promised us clean intellectual property," the banker shouted. "You guaranteed the code was an unencumbered corporate asset. He could not guarantee anything." I interrupted, shutting the banker down. "Because he never bothered to understand the business he was supposedly running. But his incompetence does not stop there." I took a step closer to David. He pressed himself harder against the digital screen, trying to melt into the wall. Savannah was weeping silently in the corner, realizing she had hitched her wagon to a man who possessed absolutely zero real power. 2 days ago, I continued projecting my voice to the back of the hall. When the institutional investors discovered David's violent behavior in the elevator and began pulling their capital, he panicked. He realized the initial public offering was collapsing. He frantically searched for an emergency bridge loan to cover the deficit. He signed a highly aggressive convertible debt agreement with a shadow-holding firm trading massive equity at a terrible valuation just to keep today's ceremony alive. I watched the exact moment the realization finally hit David. His eyes widened to an impossible size. His jaw dropped, the breath hitched in his throat as the horrific truth clicked into place. "Yes, David," I whispered directly to him, though the microphone carried the sound to everyone. "The shadow firm that purchased your toxic debt is a subsidiary of my trust. You signed over the remaining 40% of your personal equity directly to me. I own your debt. I own your algorithm. I own your entire future." The humiliation was absolute and complete. David slumped against the podium, his legs giving out entirely. He slid down the polished wood, collapsing onto his knees on the stage in front of the entire financial press corps. The arrogant tech titan, the man who had marched into my hospital room and threatened to cancel my health insurance, was completely obliterated. He stared up at me from the floor, his eyes completely hollow. He finally realized that the woman he had dismissed as a boring, dependable bean counter was actually a ruthless billionaire who had orchestrated his rise to power and had just effortlessly engineered his complete financial annihilation. He had built his entire identity on my silent labor, and I had just ripped the ground right out from under him on national television. David remained collapsed on the polished wood of the stage, his chest heaving with erratic, shallow gasps. The man who had spent the last 48 hours parading around Seattle as a tech visionary was now reduced to a trembling shell. He stared blankly at the floorboards, his mind completely incapable of processing the magnitude of his ruin. The financial press corps, smelling the ultimate corporate scandal, kept their cameras aimed squarely at his broken figure. But the execution was not over. I took a deliberate step back from the microphone, making room for the next phase of our highly coordinated siege. Naomi stepped forward to fill the space I had vacated. She moved with the predatory, unstoppable grace of a shark navigating bloody waters. Her emerald green suit caught the harsh glare of the television lights as she took her position at the center of the podium. She unclasped her heavy black leather briefcase and withdrew a massive stack of legal files. She lifted the thick bundle of documents high enough for the entire room to see, then slammed them down onto the wooden podium. The booming thud echoed through the grand hall like the dropping of a guillotine blade. The sharp sound made David flinch violently, his head snapping up to look at the towering attorney standing over him. Naomi did not look down at the pathetic man on the floor. She kept her eyes locked on the front row of the audience, specifically targeting the three men wearing conservative Navy suits with federal identification badges clipped to their lapels. These were the senior regulators from the Securities and Exchange Commission, officials required to be on site to monitor the massive public offering. "Gentlemen of the Securities and Exchange Commission," Naomi announced, her voice ringing out with terrifying metallic clarity. "My name is Naomi, and I represent the Vanguard Angel Fund. As the primary shareholder of this corporation, we are officially halting this initial public offering, effective immediately." A collective gasp ripped through the room. Halting an IPO minutes before the bell rings is an incredibly rare, catastrophic event in the financial world. The lead NASDAQ representative, standing near the digital marquee, instantly grabbed a red radio receiver and barked frantic orders to the trading floor in New York. On the massive screen behind us, the ticking countdown clock abruptly froze. The glowing corporate logo shattered into a static gray error screen. The dream was officially dead. Naomi pressed her hands flat against the podium, leaning into the microphone to deliver the killing blow. "The Vanguard Fund is halting this public offering because we are formally triggering the embezzlement and moral turpitude clawback clause embedded in the Chief Executive Officer's proxy agreement." David let out a wounded, guttural noise. He scrambled to his knees, reaching out toward the legal files, but Ryan stepped forward, blocking his path with a solid, unyielding stance. David shrank back, his eyes darting frantically around the room, searching for anyone who might save him. He found only disgusted stares and the relentless glare of camera lenses. Over the past 18 months, Naomi continued her voice slicing through the heavy silence. David has utilized his executive authority to bypass secondary financial approvals. He systematically siphoned $4 million of investor capital out of the core development fund. He routed this stolen capital through a network of fraudulent shell companies registered to a post office box in the Cayman Islands. The murmurs in the crowd grew into angry shouts. The institutional investors who had remained in the room stood up, their faces flushed with fury. They realized they had almost poured their clients' money into a massive criminal enterprise. The final destination for these stolen funds was not operational development, Naomi stated, gesturing sharply toward the corner of the stage, where Savannah was weeping uncontrollably. The $4 million was laundered back into the United States to purchase a luxury mountain estate in Aspen, Colorado. An estate deeded entirely to his public relations director. We possess the complete digital server logs, the forged wire transfers, and the offshore banking records. Everything has been fully documented and submitted to the federal authorities. David scrambled to his feet, holding his hands up in a desperate gesture of surrender. "That is a lie," he shouted, his voice cracking horribly. "Savannah did that. She set up the accounts. I did not know." Naomi did not even blink. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small digital audio player. She held it directly against the microphone. She hit a single button. The crystal-clear audio of David's voice flooded the grand hall. The recording Mitchell had captured the previous day echoed off the high ceilings. The entire room heard David boasting about wiping the server logs, framing his mistress, and securing the stolen $4 million. The undeniable confession hung in the air, instantly suffocating any remaining defense David could possibly mount. Therefore, Naomi announced, turning off the recording and staring down at David with absolute contempt. Because the chief executive officer signed a direct proxy agreement 2 days ago, he legally waived his corporate limited liability. The corporate veil has been officially pierced. The Vanguard Fund is executing immediate total asset liquidation. David gripped his chest, stumbling backward. "What does that mean?" He gasped, his eyes wide with sheer panic. "What are you doing to me?" "It means you own absolutely nothing," Naomi answered coldly. "As of this exact second, every single one of your personal bank accounts has been frozen by federal mandate. Your investment portfolios are locked. The deed to your luxury penthouse is seized. Your luxury vehicles are currently being towed from the corporate parking garage. Every dollar you have ever earned is now collateral for the $4 million you stole from your investors. You are entirely destitute." David pulled his expensive smartphone from his pocket with trembling fingers. He frantically opened his mobile banking application. The screen refreshed. Where there once sat millions of dollars in personal wealth, the bold digital numbers now read absolute zero. Several accounts even displayed massive negative balances due to the immediate clawback penalties. His credit cards were canceled. His emergency funds were erased. He had been stripped down to the very lint in his pockets. The reality of his profound failure crashed down on him with devastating force. He looked at the expensive custom suit he was wearing, suddenly realizing it was the only thing of value he had left in the world. He had traded his loyal wife, his unborn child, and his entire moral compass for the promise of unlimited power. Now he did not even have enough money to buy a cup of coffee. The grand hall, filled with the very people he had wanted to impress, watched his utter degradation with cold, unforgiving eyes. The legal guillotine had dropped perfectly, severing his empire from his grasp and leaving him to bleed out on the marble floor of his own ruined celebration. The heavy silence that followed David's financial execution was suddenly shattered by the wail of sirens outside the venue. Through the massive glass walls of the grand hall, the flashing lights of federal vehicles painted the lobby in aggressive strokes of red and blue. The heavy oak doors, currently guarded by Ryan and his private security team, were thrust open one final time. A dozen federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters FBI emblazoned across their backs stormed into the room. They moved with absolute terrifying military precision, fanning out across the red carpet to secure every exit. The lead agent, a tall man with a stern face and an uncompromising demeanor, marched directly down the center aisle. He held a thick stack of warrants in his hand, documents secured directly through the encrypted evidence packages Ryan had transmitted to the Department of Justice earlier that morning. The financial press corps scrambled to clear the path, their cameras swiveling frantically to capture the escalating chaos. The spectacle had just shifted from a corporate bloodbath to a major federal criminal raid. David scrambled backward on the stage, his polished leather shoes slipping against the wood. He hit the digital marquee and slid sideways, looking like a trapped animal desperate for an escape route that simply did not exist. The illusion of his power was completely eradicated. He was no longer a visionary chief executive officer. He was a cornered fugitive, facing the full crushing weight of the United States federal government. In the corner of the stage, the sheer pressure of the advancing federal agents completely broke Savannah. The reality of the high-priority criminal tax audit she received yesterday suddenly merged with the horrifying sight of handcuffs clipping against the agents' belts. Her fragile composure shattered into a million jagged pieces. The delusion of her glamorous billionaire lifestyle instantly evaporated, leaving behind nothing but the terrifying prospect of decades in a federal penitentiary. Savannah let out a raw, hysterical shriek. She lunged across the podium, her crimson designer gown tangling around her legs as she threw herself directly at David. Before he could even raise his hands to defend himself, Savannah swung her arm with ferocious, unhinged momentum. Her open palm connected with David's cheek in a brutal, ringing slap that echoed loudly across the silent hall. David stumbled sideways from the sheer force of the blow, clutching his reddened face in absolute shock. "He forced me to launder the money," Savannah screamed, pointing a trembling manicured finger right at his chest. The microphones captured her frantic confession, broadcasting her panic to every journalist in the room. It was his idea. He bypassed the secondary approvals. He told me to sign the Cayman Island bank documents and promised it was just a legal tax shelter. I did not know he was stealing from the investors. He set me up to take the fall. David lunged forward, grabbing Savannah by the wrists in a desperate attempt to silence her. "Shut your mouth, you stupid girl," he hissed, his face twisted in vicious fury. "You are ruining everything. You spent that money just as happily as I did." They struggled against the backdrop of their own ruined initial public offering, fighting like rats in a sinking cage. The glamorous facade of the ultimate corporate power couple dissolved into a pathetic, vicious brawl. The Wall Street journalists pushed closer, their high-definition camera lenses capturing every second of the spectacular meltdown. Flashbulbs fired in a relentless, blinding storm, permanently immortalizing the brutal implosion of David's carefully crafted lie. The federal agents did not wait for the argument to conclude. They bounded up the podium steps with swift, uncompromising authority. Two agents grabbed David by the shoulders, forcefully tearing him away from Savannah. They slammed him chest first against the wooden podium he had used to boast about his genius just 10 minutes prior. His arms were wrenched forcefully behind his back. The cold, metallic click of steel handcuffs ratcheting tight around his wrists cut through the noise of the shouting crowd. Another pair of agents surrounded Savannah. She collapsed to her knees, weeping hysterically and begging the officers to look at her phone, swearing she had text messages proving David manipulated her. The agents remained entirely stoic, hoisting her to her feet and securing her wrists in heavy iron cuffs. Her expensive designer gown dragged against the floorboards as she sobbed, completely stripped of her arrogant public relations persona. The lead federal agent stepped up to the microphone, his deep voice commanding absolute compliance from the room. "David, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, massive corporate embezzlement, and severe violations of the Securities Exchange Act. Savannah, you are under arrest for money laundering and accessory to major financial fraud." The agent recited their Miranda rights with a cold, rhythmic cadence. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. Do you understand the rights I have just read to you?" David could not speak. The man who loved the sound of his own voice more than anything in the world was rendered entirely mute. The cameras flashed endlessly, burning the image of his humiliation into the permanent public record. He was sweating profusely. His custom suit wrinkled and ruined, his dignity completely stripped away. The brilliant founder was leaving his own celebration in chains. As the agents began to march them down the steps of the podium, the sea of reporters aggressively closed in around them. Journalists shoved microphones into their faces, shouting aggressive questions about the stolen $4 million, the Aspen mansion, and the violent elevator security footage that was currently trending across global financial news networks. The public relations nightmare David had feared was unfolding 1,000 times worse than he ever imagined. I stood my ground at the edge of the stage, flanked by Naomi and Ryan. I watched the federal agents parade the traitors down the long red carpet. The same red carpet David had strutted across with absolute arrogance just an hour ago was now the path of his ultimate walk of shame. I felt no pity. I felt no remorse. I felt only the profound cleansing satisfaction of absolute justice. I had taken the horrific trauma they inflicted upon me in that pitch-black elevator shaft and forged it into an inescapable steel trap. The execution was flawless, the timing was perfect, and the absolute destruction of their lives was entirely self-inflicted. The federal agents tightened their grip on David, forcing him to walk forward. The heavy polished leather shoes that had confidently strutted across the stage mere minutes ago now dragged against the red carpet. The procession moved slowly through the center of the grand hall. The sea of reporters pressed inward, creating a claustrophobic tunnel of flashing cameras and shouting voices. Microphones were shoved toward David's face, demanding statements about the stolen $4 million and the offshore accounts. He kept his head bowed, his chin practically resting on his chest, desperately trying to hide his tear-stained face from the relentless media glare. Savannah was marched out first, her hysterical sobbing echoing over the noise of the crowd. She was completely broken, her grand billionaire fantasies replaced by the horrifying reality of a federal indictment. As she passed by the front row of institutional investors, the very people she had tried to charm with her public relations smile turned their backs on her in absolute disgust. She was quickly escorted through the heavy oak doors and out into the freezing rain, disappearing into the back of a waiting federal transport vehicle. David was next. The two agents flanking him marched him directly down the center aisle, leading him straight toward the exit where I stood waiting. I did not move an inch. I remained perfectly still, my hands resting lightly over my pregnant stomach, projecting an aura of untouchable authority. Naomi stood to my right, her arms crossed, watching the ruined chief executive officer approach with a look of supreme calculating satisfaction. Ryan stood to my left, his posture rigid and commanding, silently challenging anyone who dared to step too close to me. As David approached the perimeter of our stance, a bottleneck of aggressive journalists surged forward, temporarily blocking the main exit doors. The federal agents were forced to halt their march for a brief moment to clear a secure path through the aggressive media swarm. This temporary delay forced David to stop directly in front of me. The physical distance between us was less than 3 feet. He slowly raised his head. The man looking back at me was completely unrecognizable from the arrogant tech titan I had married. His custom suit was torn at the shoulder, stained with sweat, and the artificial soot he had smeared on himself for sympathy. His perfect hair was matted to his forehead, but it was his eyes that revealed the true extent of his devastation. They were wide, frantic, and completely hollowed out by fear. The towering ego that had fueled his entire existence had been entirely eradicated, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, pathetic shell of a man. He looked at my face, searching desperately for any lingering trace of the compliant, forgiving wife he had manipulated for years. He found absolutely nothing but cold, hardened steel. His gaze dropped slowly to my pregnant stomach. A violent shudder ripped through his body. He realized with absolute crushing clarity that he had traded his family, his freedom, and his future for a fleeting illusion of power that I had controlled the entire time. The sheer gravity of his absolute failure finally shattered his legs. David broke formation violently, twisting against the grip of the federal agents. Before they could stop him, his knees buckled entirely. He collapsed onto the red carpet, falling heavily right at my feet. The agents immediately grabbed his shoulders, to haul him back up, but he resisted with surprising frantic strength, letting his body go entirely limp, so he remained on the floor. The reporters surrounding us gasped their camera shutters, firing in a frenzied, blinding symphony of light. They were capturing the ultimate corporate surrender live on national television. David looked up at me from his knees. Tears streamed freely down his face, cutting clean tracks through the dark soot on his cheeks. He was completely stripped of his pride, reduced to begging in front of the very people he had tried to impress. He leaned forward, straining against the heavy steel handcuffs biting into his wrists. "Claire, please." David begged, his voice a ragged, desperate wheeze. He choked on his own tears, gasping for air. "I made a mistake. I am so sorry. Please, you have to stop this. You control the funds. You can tell the federal agents this is a misunderstanding. I will give you everything. I will sign whatever you want. Just do not let them put me in a cage." I stared down at him in absolute silence. His manipulation tactics were so ingrained that even at the absolute bottom of his ruin, he was still trying to negotiate a deal. When I did not respond, David grew even more frantic. He played his final, most despicable card. He nodded toward my stomach, using the very child he had abandoned as a desperate bargaining chip. "For the sake of our unborn child, Claire." David pleaded, his voice breaking into a pathetic whine. "Please do not do this. Our baby needs a father. You cannot let our child grow up knowing their father is locked away in a federal prison. Please, I am begging you for the baby." The sheer audacity of his plea did not spark anger. It only solidified the absolute coldness in my veins. He dared to invoke the title of father after what he had done. I looked down at the pathetic, weeping man kneeling on the carpet. The flashing camera lights illuminated his desperate, tear-streaked face. But all I saw was the heavy steel hatch of the elevator slamming shut in the dark. I took one deliberate step closer to him. The federal agents tensed, but Ryan raised a single hand, holding them back for one final moment. I looked directly into David's terrified eyes. My voice was low, but it carried a chilling, lethal resonance that cut perfectly through the noise of the grand hall. "When you stepped on my shoulder in that elevator and left us to die in the dark, you severed your rights as a father," I said, every word dripping with absolute ice. "Enjoy your new life in a much smaller, much colder box." The words struck him with the force of a physical blow. The last tiny flicker of hope in his eyes was instantly extinguished. He let out a loud, agonizing wail, a sound of pure, unadulterated despair. He finally understood that there was no negotiation, no forgiveness, and absolutely no escape. I had handed down the final, irrevocable sentence. I did not wait for his response. I did not waste another second looking at the wreckage of the man I used to love. I turned my back on him, completely facing the heavy oak doors of the grand hall. Behind me, the federal agents forcefully hauled David to his feet. He thrashed weakly against their grip, sobbing hysterically as they dragged him away from the podium. His agonizing cries echoed over the frantic questions of the reporters, fading slowly as the agents hauled him out into the freezing, relentless rain. The heavy doors slammed shut behind him, permanently sealing his fate and officially closing the darkest chapter of my life. As those heavy oak doors of the grand hall slammed shut, sealing away the agonizing cries of the man who had tried to destroy me, the ensuing silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the collective exhales of the stunned financial press corps. I stood at the edge of the stage, flanked by Naomi and Ryan, feeling the last remnants of my old life fall away completely. I did not offer any further statements to the journalists or the shocked institutional investors. I simply turned and walked out through the private executive exit, leaving the chaotic aftermath for the federal authorities to sort out. My calculated war was officially over, and the victory was absolute. The chapter of my life defined by his manipulation was permanently closed. 6 months passed, bringing a swift and unforgiving reckoning. The justice system moves with lethal efficiency when faced with undeniable, high-definition evidence of federal crimes. I sat in the polished wooden gallery of the United States District Court, watching the final sentencing play out. David stood before the federal judge entirely stripped of his custom-tailored suits and arrogant smirk. He wore a standard-issue bright orange prison jumpsuit. His posture was deeply slouched, his shoulders rounded in permanent defeat. The judge showed absolutely no leniency, citing his egregious breach of fiduciary duty, his highly calculated and malicious corporate embezzlement, and his blatant, remorseless securities fraud against the very investors he promised to protect. The gavel fell with a heavy, echoing thud, condemning David to 15 long years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. He would spend the next decade and a half locked in a sterile concrete cell, completely erased from the elite financial circles he had sacrificed his soul to join. There would be no early parole, no special treatment, and absolutely no redemption for his crimes. Savannah fared no better during her separate hearing. The judge sentenced her to 5 years in federal prison for her direct role in money laundering and acting as an accessory to major financial fraud. Furthermore, the court authorized the complete forfeiture of all her illicitly obtained assets, the luxurious mountain estate in Aspen. The designer wardrobes and the offshore accounts were seized entirely by the federal government to provide financial restitution to the defrauded startup investors. She wept bitterly as the heavily armed federal bailiffs firmly gripped her arms and led her out of the crowded courtroom, finally realizing that playing the willing, greedy accomplice to a malignant narcissist guaranteed her absolute and total destruction in the eyes of the law. Her tears elicited absolutely no sympathy from anyone. With the toxic elements entirely excised, the company required immediate and massive restructuring. I utilized my dominant equity position through the Vanguard Angel Fund to take absolute control of the board of directors. I did not want to serve as the chief executive officer. My expertise belonged in high-level strategy and forensic oversight. Instead, I officially promoted Mitchell to the chief executive position. He had proven his unyielding loyalty, sharp tactical mind, and exceptional financial integrity when he secured the audio recording of David's confession. Under Mitchell's steady, principled leadership, and with my strict financial guidance from the head of the executive board, the software startup successfully stabilized its market position. We systematically cleaned the operational ledgers, painstakingly rebuilt vital investor trust, and ultimately launched the initial public offering on our own precise terms, emerging stronger and completely untethered from the dark shadow of David's deceitful reign. But my greatest victory had absolutely nothing to do with stock valuations or corporate takeovers. My true triumph occurred on a quiet, sunlit morning in a serene maternity ward. The atmosphere in the delivery room was the exact opposite of the pitch-black, suffocating terror of that falling elevator. I gave birth to a healthy, beautiful baby girl. She possessed a strong, fierce cry and bright eyes that filled my heart with an overwhelming, profound joy. I held my daughter securely against my chest, feeling the steady, reassuring rhythm of her tiny heartbeat. It was the precise moment my true life began. The story of Claire's survival and ultimate triumph offers a profound lesson on the nature of trust, resilience, and the true definition of strength. When trapped in a literal and metaphorical dark place, Claire realized that the very person she had selflessly uplifted was willing to sacrifice her for his own preservation. Her harrowing experience teaches us a highly vital truth. We must never, ever allow our kindness, unyielding loyalty, and silent sacrifices to be weaponized against us by those who lack basic integrity. Too often, we pour our finite resources, genuine love, and precious energy into building up the people around us, assuming they will naturally offer the exact same devotion in return. Claire operated safely from the shadows, securing her husband's corporate empire, while expecting nothing but mutual respect. Yet a severe crisis instantly strips away the delicate facade of performative affection, revealing the raw, unfiltered reality of a person's true character. When David ruthlessly abandoned her to secure his own lucrative future, he expected her to remain a silent, passive victim. Instead, Claire demonstrated that true lasting empowerment comes directly from aggressively reclaiming your own narrative. She did not waste her energy weeping endlessly over the cold ashes of a shattered illusion. She brilliantly used the darkness to forge the specific weapons necessary to completely dismantle the toxic structure that held her down. This gripping narrative beautifully illustrates that our darkest moments do not have to be our breaking points. They can be the exact crucible where our greatest personal boundaries are permanently forged. It serves as a powerful reminder that walking away from manipulative people is not a failure, but an act of profound self-love. If you found value in this reflection, please share your thoughts below and subscribe to our channel for more empowering stories.